Ji, Assalamu alaikum everyone. On behalf of Beacon House School System, the organizer of School of Tomorrow events, I would like to welcome you to a World of Tomorrow 2021 and beyond towards happier futures, the 13th edition of SOT events. The non-profit SOT event series was launched by Beacon House in 2000 as part of its CSR and to help inform the direction of the organization, while also engaging global communities in conversations shaping the future of schools and societies. It's a fully virtual event. My name is Malik, and I am Senior Manager Education Operations at Beacon House. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to this live session at the 13th edition of SOT events. I would now like to introduce you to our workshop facilitator, Mr. Thom Markham. Considered one of the founding fathers of project-based learning, Mr. Thom Markham is an educator, positive psychologist, and global entrepreneur, dedicated to youth development and a positive future. In 2015, Thom founded Pbl Global, a worldwide partner-based organization offering a transformative strengths-focused model of project-based learning that fits the next 50 years of education by integrating Pbl, well-being, design thinking, coaching and mentorship, intellectual challenge, personalization, and social entrepreneurship. He has shared his expertise with over 6,000 teachers and 400 schools worldwide, including Beacon House, and now offers a breakthrough set of free online courses through the Pbl Global School that can prepare educators in every country to be future ready. Before we begin, I would like to inform our viewers that you may ask questions at any time using the question comment function on the SOT website, and we'll address some of them at the end of the session. Without further delay, I would like to hand it over to Mr. Thom Markham, who will talk about some interesting ideas today. Over to you, Thom.
Thank you so much, Kanwal. It's just great to be here. I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk about the world of tomorrow, but even more to talk about happier futures, which is something I think we're all focused on. So I want to just draw your attention here after welcoming you to how we're going to structure this presentation today and to the title of the presentation. I gave some thought to this. We've just come out of probably the most, I would call interesting is one way to describe it, the most interesting year in several generations. It's affected all of us, and it certainly has affected education. And it's affected education in a way that really has shifted the ecosystem, as I call it. By ecosystem, I mean we have now clearly entered the digital age in education. And I know that this isn't necessarily entirely new because we've been using digital tools for a while, but we have now had across the planet really many students operating at home virtually, and that has really changed the game, if you will, because I don't think we're going to go back to the old normal of everyone being in the classroom. We're going to have some combination of digital work. And holding young people is really critical because I have found over the past year, talking to teachers and to students, that really we haven't done such a great job of what I call holding young people in a digital space. Now, where I am in the States, I think the pandemic and the virtual teaching and learning actually revealed quite a big gap in the system, particularly at the secondary level. And that gap is that teachers don't have as strong a relationship with young people and their students as they might have thought they had. And so when they went online, many of those students disappeared or didn't show up to their Zoom calls or didn't do their homework. And always it could be traced back to the fact that teachers had not really created that relationship with students that would draw them into the learning process when they were learning at home or in a virtual environment. And conversely, those teachers who did do that were really quite successful. They were very successful at having students do really high quality work. So holding young people, by that I mean establishing, as I'll talk a little bit about further along in the presentation, establishing a channel of trust and connection with students. Now, who are those students? That's really the big question. And I've chosen the metaphor of the Jedi. Now, this is an endorsement of Star Wars, or I'm not trying to take this metaphor of the Jedi too far, but this is going to require a new kind of student, and it's going to require certain qualities that we're going to have to emphasize as we move forward. Because this new world, the world of tomorrow, 2021 and beyond, is likely to be quite different than what we've experienced before. And as that world changes, our students are going to have to change, our teaching is going to have to change, and parent expectations are going to have to change. Now, this doesn't mean that we're going to throw out everything. We've made a lot of gains in education over the last 10 to 15 years, and we really have entered into what some people call the fourth industrial revolution. What kind of learner do we want today? We've certainly moved towards inquiry, towards deeper engagement, towards deeper learning. We now are much better at helping students practice the 4 C's, the skills of the workforce, collaboration, communication, and so forth. We use groups and teams much more than we used to, so we're teaching students how to collaborate. That's very helpful. And we've gotten better at having students grapple with authentic problems and to really be a little more immersed in their community. And all that needs to remain. Now, the last on that list at the left, their standards and exam ready, is still on our list. We'll have to see where that one goes as the world evolves, because there is a lot of discussion about how useful those standards are, how exams can be used, whether we use too many exams. And I have some thoughts about that. And I'll just give you a slight preview. I think that the standards are going to diminish in favor of some other ways to hold students accountable for the kind of work they do. So what's this look like? Let's take a look at what this Jedi concept looks like. I have in mind 5 qualities. These aren't the only ones. These are ones that came to mind for me as I thought about what kind of student we're trying to develop or have really support students and young people as they develop these qualities. That's a better way to say it. And I have in mind at least 5 different aspects of their learning and their educational experience and the relationship to teachers and students that are going to become important. And the first one I'm going to put down is courage. And why would I put that? Because I think to get through to the world of tomorrow and to the happier world, we probably have a journey in front of us before that happens. And that journey is going to be characterized, frankly, by some chaos, some climate disruption. We have all sorts of social issues, inequality, migration. We have a world in flux. So the world of tomorrow and likely beyond 2021 is going to be a world in which change is not just going to be present. We know that. It might be highly disruptive. I think we're going to have a generation of young people who are going to be wondering, how exactly do I face that change? And I think that courage, the ability to look carefully at problems, the ability to engage, the ability not to be so fearful that you're not really engaging in the world, is going to be critical. So as I look forward to the future, looking at character and courage as probably number 1 on my list of things we're going to have to help, the qualities that we're going to have to help young people develop. Now, we do a lot of discussion about problem solving and problem solvers. That's really big on our 4th industrial revolution agenda. How do we develop problem solvers? Well, I think in the future, if we're going to solve some of these issues, we're going to have young people work harder at find those issues. So I prefer the term of the future to be the problem finder. And the problem finder is really a young person who can look out at his or her community and try to observe and think, how can this be solved? What is the problem here? Now, it's pretty common in the way we do education today to set up some big problems with students. For example, climate change. That's a common one. Homelessness is a common one. Recycling, reuse of materials. We have sort of, if you will, kind of a standard list of topics we cover. But I'm hoping as we move forward to find a really happier world, that we'll have students who will be looking around their own neighborhoods, their own communities, looking at roads that aren't good, or infrastructure that's not good, or different aspects. I always say when I go to a school that within a mile of a school, there are 100 projects waiting to happen. It's just a matter of finding them. So I think helping young people do, for example, community mapping, if you know that method, where you look at and map a community's resources and challenges. These kinds of things, I think, are going to be more important in the future. Schools are really going to have to help young people reach out beyond either the walls of the classroom or that virtual space and think, what can I do to help my community? How do I help? What's necessary? What isn't right? What needs to be fixed? So that's what I mean by the qualities of the problem finder. Now, this third one is very interesting. Research in social neuroscience is starting to show quite clearly that our brains are changing and reacting in response to living in a highly connected environment. I call this communal intelligence. We are on the way to some sort of mind sharing, if you will, in which we are collectively working together. So we're taking this beyond group work. It goes beyond just teams. That's part of it. And we do a good job in Pbl of teaching that ordinarily, but I think really encouraging young people to reach out to adults in the community, adults across the globe. The virtual environment allows you to talk to anyone, anywhere. We certainly know that, and it's certainly been reinforced over the past year. I don't think in project-based learning that's been done in a virtual environment over the past year, we've done such a great job of that, but I think that's something that should be on our agenda. How are we going to help young people reach out to resources across the globe, to find experts, to find interested adults, to find support? How are they going to find peers who are doing similar work in a different country, for example? So the idea of communal intelligence to me is very much at the center of how we're creating the world tomorrow. It's going to take many minds working together to solve many of our issues. And the old notion of education as being an isolated experience, sort of the student in the ivory tower working alone at a desk, that's not going to work very well. And we do know that that can be reinforced in a virtual environment in which a young person is working home on a computer screen and may not be connecting to others. That's something that as teachers of tomorrow, we're going to have to think, how do we connect them and work hard to have them connect with each other, which of course brings up a whole set of considerations around privacy of students and who they should connect to. I understand all those issues, but the bottom line is they have to connect with one another and connect with adult society as resources, because there's a lot of knowledge that is held outside the classroom. As we all know, the teacher is no longer the repository or the holder of all information. Information is distributed these days, and students need to be able to go after that information. One of the big shifts I believe we're going to have to make, particularly if we do want to have a happier world, we're going to have to look for ways to reward service, contribution, kindness, empathy, the qualities in which we reach out to others in our society, to our friends, our peers, our family, our community, and really intentionally use those qualities to help our community. And then the question becomes, how do we intentionally teach that and help young people really find those qualities within themselves? And of course, one way is to begin to change our reward system from grades and test results and just university admissions to how do you display kindness? How do you display empathy? How do you display service? Those are things we can build into good project-based work. And I think that project-based work has we have a great opportunity, and I'll discuss that in just a moment, to really help develop those kinds of qualities through project-based work. And I think they're critical. And we sort of very much related to that. And this is where I have questions about what the standards are going to be as we move forward. I'll sort of make a bold statement here. When we ask questions, which I really encourage you to do, Kanwal encourage you to keep your questions. I'd love to talk about this with you and see what you think. We have sustainable development goals. We have a sustainable development vision through the United Nations, the SDGs. Those sustainable development goals, to me, really are going to become the new curriculum. I say that because I think, given the chaos of modern life, given climate change, given some of the severe issues that we face, focusing on sustainable development goals is going to become inevitable. We have to start using those goals as really the organizing principle for school. And I know that sounds quite radical. Maybe that won't happen. If it does happen, it might take a long time. But I would certainly encourage you, if you're a PBL teacher and you're interested in projects and interested in promoting the welfare of the planet, if you will, finding that world of tomorrow, thinking about how you incorporate sustainable development goals into your projects and how you make them central to your projects. You don't have to do all the goals at one time, but just think about alerting students to how that project-based work fits into sustainable goals thinking. I think that's critical. A lot of students still don't know enough about the sustainable development goals. I think it's critical that they learn and that be an important organizing principle for them. So those are the 5 things that I see about the future of learners, of young people, of students, and the qualities that we can start to build into our virtual system, holding them in a way that allows them to develop the qualities that are going to be necessary for them to succeed, but also necessary for all of us to succeed. That's really the question. How do all of us succeed? And it's going to take each of us working together. So that's the Jedi of tomorrow. Now, that doesn't mean to get there we're going to really dispense with everything we've done before, as I said. So let's look at a minute how we're going to proceed. So I have some ideas on how we do this. And the first thing I would say is project-based learning works. It works well. I've been doing it for a long time. As Kanwal mentioned at the top of our broadcast, I've been to over 400 schools, probably worked with 6,000 teachers. I've seen many, many students working in projects. I've worked with them. And I am convinced that project-based learning is really the future. Now, not every educator would probably agree with me, but many more agree than used to. And there is a worldwide movement towards using project-based learning. And the project-based learning that we are encouraging or should encourage is really best practices-based project-based learning, not just projects. So for those of you who are familiar with project-based learning, you may know this list on this graphic quite well. Maybe it's very familiar to you. For those of you who are just entering into the project-based learning discussion, I'll just kind of quickly show you and talk a little bit about what these best practices are and why they're so critical, because they are well developed, they are accepted. It's the way top quality PBL teachers do top quality projects. And it starts really at the upper right hand corner where you really have a good challenge for students. And that challenge is related to usually an authentic problem, a meaningful problem, a relevant problem. It is what I call the why behind the project. And every project-based learning teacher who's doing a project should really be able to say, what's the why? Why is this worth doing for me as a teacher? Why is it worth doing for students who may be investing 2 to 3 or 4 weeks into a project? Why would they invest that? What's the challenge and the meaning behind this project? Everything really in a good project starts there. Now, once you have the challenge, once you're decided on then you create a driving question. A driving question is the problem to be solved. At the heart of project-based learning is a problem. Project-based learning derives from problem-based learning, something actually we forget these days sometimes. So that driving question is about a problem to be solved. And there's a good reason for having that problem to be solved. The problem to be solved is a wicked problem, doesn't have clear answers, requires thoughtful investigation, requires some design and some investment in the student. And as they go through that process and invest in solving a wicked problem, that's what brings up their skills and strengths, the kinds of skills and strengths that we're very interested in project-based learning. So that's what the function of that a problem, and it really is critical to what we're doing in PBL. Then you're thinking about what would the students do if they solve the problem? What kind of products would they deliver? I call this start with results. What would they give to you? How would they show you as a teacher what they're doing and what their thinking is and how they intend to solve this problem? So that's where you connect up the question and problem with the results. And once you've got those three elements, by the way, together in a project, you really have a lot of the project done. That's really the core of it. And then you move around this graphic, and the next step would be to build some sort of assessment system, because you want to know whether the products that have been created, how good they are, do they work, do they meet the criteria, do they solve the problem. And for those of you who are familiar, you will know we always use some sort of performance rubrics in project-based learning, because project-based learning is a performance-based enterprise. And so when students are creating a product at the end, it is something in which they might perform, they might deliver in person, they might deliver a virtual product, but it's always performance driven along with being content driven. But the heart of PBL, of a good project, is really a performance driven project. Begin with the end in mind is for you as the teacher. That's really how you intend to have this project roll out. What is your plan? This is where projects can fall down and become confusing. But what it means is at the beginning of the project, you are thinking about some basic questions. How much will students investigate on their own? How much will I teach them? Now, one of the misnomers and confusion around project-based learning is sometimes teachers don't think they actually teach during a project, but in fact, you can do a lot of teaching in a project. You can even do lectures. The point is you are trying to find that balance of students, them working on their own, doing the investigation, doing the inquiry, and you providing the just-in-time information or the content or the background that enables them to go deeper into their investigation. That's what we mean by begin with the end in mind. Now, then students go to work. That's their part. And they design solutions, they solve problems, they're working on investigation, and they are doing that work. Now, how long that lasts in a project depends on the complexity of their tasks and the complexity of the challenge. Generally, it's going to be a week or two as they design and solve and begin to come up with products. This last part, end with mastery, that's not always put into best practices for PBL, but for me, it's a critical element. And that is because it is so important that students end up projects feeling a sense of, number one, accomplishment, number two, having done good quality work. This is where you get lifelong learning. This is where you get a sense of satisfaction. This is where you get students saying, oh, I enjoyed that process. It is my belief that students enjoy doing good work. They enjoy being challenged. They enjoy pushing themselves and coming up with a product or result that they can be proud of. That's what I mean by end with mastery. Now, all of these elements in this graphic have sub-elements behind them. I'm not going to talk about those today, but there's a deep set of practices behind this whole process. And if you want to become familiar with PBL, you can get into these practices. I will say something right at the end. I offer free online courses that you can take, 3 free online courses. I'll give you a link to that at the end of our presentation today. Many folks from Pakistan, India, parts of the Middle East are enrolled in these courses. It can give you all the basic elements of PBL. So that's best practices. Now, the other thing I want to emphasize here is what I call PBL 2.0. So this is the same graphic. It's the same set of best practices, but reframed to think of PBL not as an academic strategy or an academic method. It's a people development method. I discovered this many years ago when I started to work with PBL, and I thought, well, how do people actually learn in life outside of school? Well, they learn through a challenge. I can't tie my shoes. I'm 4 years old. I'm just learning to tie my shoes. That's a challenge. You practice, you play around, you learn to tie your shoes, and you move on. And that's a metaphor or analogy that lasts all through your life. We learn through having a challenge or problem to be solved. We test it out, we practice, we find some solutions, we come up with a solution or answer, and usually we share it with somebody. That is basically what PBL is. So from my standpoint, PBL, the wonder and the beauty of project-based learning is that it's not just an academic strategy. It's actually a way of developing young people because it is a youth development method. And I've just sort of made some additions to the original graphic to show you at what points in the best practices in a project you can think about incorporating some of these deeper strengths. So the challenge, passion, and purpose. We're finding that passion projects worked really well in this past pandemic period virtually when students were able to invest in their own passion in a project. They produced superior work. Number two, they felt a great sense of satisfaction being able to sort of invest themselves in topics that matter to them, passion and purpose. The driving question is about setting up a wicked problem. That's really an intellectual challenge as well as a problem challenge. It also incorporates those problem finding skills that I talked about. They're really part of that, creating a driving question. And by the way, again, for those of you who do PBL, you probably know this. For those of you who know it, you may have a question. Students can be involved in crafting this driving question. You can do it. The teacher can do the driving question. Students can invent the driving question, or what I think really works well is when students and teachers discuss the driving question together so they align themselves on the task and the goals and the vision for the projects. Starting at the results, that's really about self-management. Are you going to learn the skills of self-managing your own learning? Are you going to take responsibility for your own learning? Also starts to incorporate the growth mindset. How are those results going to show that you have changed as a student and a person? I often say that one sign of a great project is when students leave that project being different than when they entered the project. They are a different person because they have experienced learning and growth in a way that changes them. Now, that's the ideal. It's a high-minded goal, but it's an excellent goal for a PBL teacher to keep in mind. How will this project change students? The assessment, reflection, self-awareness. This is a big part of PBL. You want students to reflect on their learning. I often say that a project is never over until the actual reflection on the project has taken place. So in our ordinary system of education, the students hand in their work, and the next day they start a new unit or a new chapter. I always encourage in project-based learning that there be an intermediate step. That is, you spend a day just reflecting together as a class. What did we learn? What did we like about the project? And if you want to really be brave as a teacher, what didn't you like about the project and how could I have done better in terms of designing the project? And then other elements come into this. When you're working with the beginning in mind, how much persistence and attention will students put into their work? On the inquiry particularly, it's easy to give up. Sometimes students look at a website, they can't figure out what it is. How persistent are they? How much attention do they bring to the task? Persistence is a big one these days because our sort of media-driven society does not encourage persistence so much as sort of very quick attention and on to something else. So as educators, we're to some extent sort of fighting the tide here, but teaching students to be persistent as they go deep, that can be all part of this PBL process. And the design thinking and problem solving, design thinking more and more is really almost synonymous with project-based learning these days. Students are going through this design process where they come up with an idea, they draft, they refine, they share, which requires, interestingly enough, empathy. So for those of you familiar with the design process, you know that empathy is the first stage in design thinking, figuring out what the customer wants or why the solution is necessary. And then more and more, I also think we're going to moving as we become a more global world, and this is certainly part of becoming the virtual Jedi. A student is a global person these days, which requires not just what I would call cultural acceptance, or sometimes we just call it sort of being culturally responsive. I prefer this term, which I came across several years ago, cultural humility, and that is understanding that every culture has something to offer. Every culture has strengths. Probably every culture has some challenges, but cultural humility allows you to adopt that attitude of openness to accept and learn from other cultures. And that certainly is critical to what's going on in the world today. And it's going to be critical to getting students who are really good at PBL and who have, as you see up there in the upper left, the self-confidence and knowledge to solve problems. Let's call it the self-confidence and knowledge to become a good Jedi. Now, some other thoughts here. We have a lot of different variations these days of PBL. The design thinking I mentioned. We have problem-based learning, place-based learning, interest-based learning, challenge-based learning, all sorts of learnings, this and that. If you're going forward as a PBL teacher, frankly, I would urge you to ignore all those categories and just think about PBL as being a method to challenge young people with interesting, provocative, and meaningful questions, problems for them to solve, which they can then share their solutions with others. Again, as I said earlier, that's the simple description of PBL. So educators, I include myself here, we have a tendency to want to break down the world in all these little terms and use a lot of terminology. It's not necessarily in PBL. It's an umbrella. It's a philosophy in teaching and learning. It's not a strategy. It's not one method. It's a philosophy of teaching and learning. And I think that's important to just maintain. Otherwise, we start to think, well, what's the difference between challenge-based learning and project-based learning? The answer is nothing really. They're just the same kind of process of challenge. So really kind of integrated in your own mind. I think that will make us more powerful as a group of project-based learning teachers who are trying to, in essence, sustain and move project-based learning forward in the world. Now, outcomes, that's going to be interesting. Now, on the right here, I have all the SDGs. Those are the stair step. Those are what I think should be the outcomes for projects of the future, for happiness tomorrow, for the world of tomorrow. But I also broke it down into what I call the project mindset, because the outcome these days in a virtual environment or in a hybrid environment or in a digital world are starting to look different than the outcomes we used to ascribe, certainly to education in a traditional way, but also even to PBL. Now, I won't go through all these. I'll just put this on the screen for a moment so that you can sort of look through this, but you can see that some of them are going to sound familiar to you. Yes, we want someone who's independent, self-managing, entrepreneurial. You have to be entrepreneurial these days. And I don't mean just to make money, but also to solve problems. But as you go through this, you can see passion, purpose, capable of continuous learning. That's down towards the right there. That's an interesting one because in a virtual environment, students actually do a lot of asynchronous learning. That was a big topic of conversation among educators over the past year. How much time do we allow students just to work on their own? And it's pretty clear to me that we're going to move forward towards a system in which partially we are instructing and partially we are setting students loose to do work on their own, asynchronous learning, continuous learning, which means we have to train them to do work and to learn without us watching them. That's really a big challenge. We want them to be collegial, collaborative. I mentioned mentors and global resources oriented to well-being. We're not going to get anywhere with learning until students feel cared for, safe, and until they feel like they're in an environment which is healthy for them in all respects. And so the well-being is critical. That's why I always say every project begins with establishing that channel of trust, channel of communication with students, making them feel like they are cared for. And as I put in the title slide, how they're being held by the adults, held in the sense of cared for. Those are going to be important, and value, service, and contribution. So that's what I mean by a project mindset. So we're now, as we move to outcomes, it's not so much specific test results or specific exam results. For me, it's this mindset is our outcome. Having students emerge from projects and going through learning experiences that allow them to be thinking, this is the way I learn, this is how I operate in the world, these are the qualities and strengths that are important to me, this is how I want to be as a person. Now, that's a high-minded goal, no question about it. We're really trying, in order to get to that world of tomorrow, that happier world, we are thinking about how do we nurture better human beings. That's a pretty big outcome, but that in fact is what we're charged with as we move through to the middle of the century and have and face a number of difficult issues. How do we create young people who are capable of meeting this challenge? How do we create young people who are capable of being Jedis? And this could be another description of what a Jedi looks like in today's world. Now, we talk a lot in Pbl about the facilitation, and we know that we're supposed to move towards being a guide on the side and a facilitator. I want to just sort of deepen that conversation before we end, because if you look at some of the words I put over to the right-hand side, we're going to have to think a little more deeply about how we guide young people. So I use the word Sherpa, guardian, co-learner. In other words, it's kind of a different mindset on our part as well. I call them the 6 interventions. That really is the 6 things you have to do with students these days. Rapport, relationship, strengths, those are critical. The kind of things where we actually intentionally develop those strong relationships. In today's world, what that means is that you as a teacher have to enter as a co-learner, because you, like everyone else, doesn't have all the answers. This new world that's evolving, the world of tomorrow, is a world of unknowns. A world of unknowns means the teacher and the student are both engaging as with beginning mind to some extent. Now, you're still the teacher, but you are going to have to model being a co-learner, meaning what don't you know, what are you going to share? That's going to be important. As much as possible, doing authentic problems from the community. I've talked about this a couple of times in the presentation. I think you can understand the importance of that. Challenges are around us. Challenges are not, how do you do a quadratic equation? That's a challenge intellectually, but that's not the challenge that's going to solve the problems of the world. And those aren't the challenges that are going to bring us the world of tomorrow. The deep collaboration, obviously quite critical. I talked about communal intelligence. That could be another phrase that we could use there. By deep collaboration, I mean really exchanging ideas, not just kind of a Facebook sharing. I mean sharing deep ideas about how we can solve problems, working together. And I would love to see that deep collaboration occur not just between students and students, but students and teachers, and of course, teachers and teachers. So one of the gaps in our current system usually is teachers do not have enough opportunity to actually collaborate. So that's going to become critical. because this communal intelligence extends to teachers as well, learning from one another, learning about project-based work. And in terms of project-based work, Pbl, collaboration among teachers, is almost a necessity. I mentioned the design thinking. I won't spend too much time on that, but design thinking is very much becoming a part of Pbl. And I would encourage all of you as Pbl teachers to become conversant and educated about design thinking. It's pretty straightforward. And particularly looking at the early stages of design thinking, what does it mean to have empathy? Because if we want our young people to be problem solvers, they have to first begin with empathy. And as they look around their community, be thinking, they must almost be feeling the problem. What needs to be done? What is imperatively done? How can I stay at home and not help solve this problem? That's the kind of empathy we're looking for. The facilitation and teaching is always an interesting problem or challenge in Pbl, but I'll say again, you facilitate and you teach in a project. You have the adult role. You are the mentor. You are the leader. You are the role model. And so sometimes you do that through facilitating and working very closely side by side with students, and other times you actually are working as more of a traditional teacher, imparting information, even while students may be listening passively. As long as you don't overdo that, there's nothing wrong with putting that into projects, which means you as the Pbl teacher really need to decide, what do they really need to know and what can they get on their own? That's a critical question. So that's what I call an intervention. Finally, in Pbl, the public product is considered essential. You always end a project with some product that is publicly shared. I think as we move into the world of tomorrow, we're moving into the world of stories. What's the story of my community? What stories am I sharing so that I can get feedback, so they can know what's happening? So encouraging students to become storytellers, I think, is on the horizon. As they become better storytellers, they become more impactful, because we know that stories impact people. And so the idea is to help them not just have a public product, but as they move forward, to tell meaningful stories about their learning and sharing that with others. For example, I would love to see some sort of worldwide site where students have a chance to share their projects, talk to each other about them. I'm hoping that will come sometime in the next 20 years, but we need a way for students to be sharing all that learning with each other across national boundaries, which barely exist these days anyway. So that's what I mean by stories and sharing. So that's the goal for 2021 and beyond. We got a lot of beyond. So happiness and the whole person, that's really what it comes down to. All the words on the left that I have there: value, service, project, problem solving, skills, continuous learning. Again, that's not going to mean much unless people are generally feeling whole and happy. And we know in our world today, it could be fragmented. It can be traumatizing. Now, I don't mean to be negative here, because I'm very much an optimist, but we also have to be realistic about the issues that young people face in coming to adulthood these days, and really focusing on their happiness, their wholeness, their holistic qualities, meaning not only what they learn academically, but how they operate with character, what are their personal strengths. Looking at students from the whole is really, to me, a critical thing. So that if we had to identify one goal, the most important goal, happiness and the whole person. So thank you. Those are some ideas for you today on the world of tomorrow. I just want to say that I'm always open to any questions from you. You can look on the website, pblglobal.com. I don't have my email listed here, but it's Thom, Thom, at pblglobal.com. And if you're really interested in doing more on Pbl at no charge, very easy, These 3 free courses are available to you through what they call the Pbl Global School. You're welcome to enroll, no charge to you. You can go through at your own pace. There's no assessment. You can do it on your phone. It's a mobile course as well as a computer-based course. And it's designed as a series of learning experiences. I really call it a playlist. So you don't even have to go through the course one module at a time. You can drop in, drop out. And again, think about it just like the music you may have on your phone. You can like play the tune that interests you for that day. So there's lots of different choices there. I think there's about 40 different experiences among the 3 courses. So that's what I have. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It was great. And Kanwal, can we answer some questions?
Put on. Gee, yes, Tom, thank you so much. So being a PBL facilitator myself, I could really relate to some of the key ideas that you talked about. But before I say a bit more, there are quite a lot of questions that we have, and I can see that a lot of teachers were watching us. The first one is when you talked about global sustainable goals. So our audience would like to know how, if you could give some ideas how to develop students' interest in sustainable development goals these days.
Well, I guess we'll have to assume we have to make them interested, but I also hope that they would be interested because their survival may depend on it. Really, it's not a choice. And so I think having a deep, sincere discussion about the future with students is the starting point, Kanwal. And that means introducing a framework for solving those problems, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. And so to me, it's being willing to have an open conversation about what the future might bring. The students can sense, they know things are not quite right in the adult world. They know that. And so, and that's why I really put courage at the beginning there, Kanwal, because it almost requires courage on the part of the teacher or instructor to bring these up and to really enter into as this co-learner or guide or some of the Sherpa. I don't know. I love that term. I'm not sure I totally understand what Sherpas do. I kind of get it, but the idea of being a very skilled guide, a very skilled guide is really what I mean by that. And so that begins with having that conversation with students. From there, it's a matter of knowing the Sustainable Development Goals well enough, Kanwal, so that you can turn them into a project, which means you have to translate that into a local or community context for a project.
Indeed, of course, when you connect it with the local context, of course, they can relate with it a lot better. And you're right, our students are very smart. They understand the needs of this world, and they're quite aware of the problems that we face in these days. Now, the next question, there are a series of questions, and they really want to know the hybrid model, the current hybrid model, where there is a combination of synchronous, asynchronous, online and offline work. And just if you could share what is your advice for educators who are trying to run PBL projects in a hybrid world?
Yes, that's a good question. Thank you. I think 2 major learnings or lessons came out of the past year when it comes to hybrid work, and particularly with hybrid project-based learning. The first is that unless you have the relationship established with your students, that channel of care and trust that I talked about, nothing else is going to happen and students are going to disappear on you. And so the schools that had a very good track record in the classroom of establishing good relationships were virtually able to seamlessly transition to hybrid work. And I would say the second is just having teacher design projects around standard curriculum is not enough of an engagement tool when you're in a hybrid environment. It is one thing to be a young person in a class with a teacher there watching you and your brain goes into work mode.
Yeah.
When you're home in your bedroom, in front of your computer or at the kitchen table or somewhere in your home, your brain doesn't kick in that way. And you have to make it work that way. And the way you make it work that way is you have a passion project. And the passion projects work quite well in the hybrid environment. And I'll just add a third here. We're trying to find the balance between the teaching and the asynchronous learning. And it was very clear to me that teachers who were skilled at this could spend 1 or 2 days presenting work or working with students, and then students could spend 1 or 2 days working on their own without guidance. Now, this is the secondary level. I've talked to third grade teachers. It's not always the same experience. The K to 5 younger children require more contact. But as you move through the older grades, they're capable of doing work on their own, which is actually much better preparation for the world they're going to go into, where they won't have a teacher watching them all the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's what I would say.
So you did talk about grade 3 here, and that brings me to my next question. Our audience want to know, I think mainly our early years educators, that what is the plan or how practical is PBL in early years environment?
I'm sorry, say it again. How effective is it in?
So how effective and practical is the idea of PBL in an early years environment where students are really young, they're in nursery, pre-nursery, and they need a lot of support from their teachers?
You know, PBL, if I understand the question fully, Kanwal, PBL is extremely effective when it's done well. But when it's not done well, it's not effective. Of course, when instruction in general is not done well, it's not effective. But PBL really suffers from that. So if you're just doing kind of what I call projects, in which you are just having the students get up out of their chairs in the classroom and do something, investigations, or that's not PBL. Those are projects. PBL follows that set of best practices that I showed in the presentation, which yourself requires skill and practice and some training. That's why I really recommend taking these free online courses if you want to become more skilled. At least gives you, what those courses do is give you fundamental knowledge of PBL, which is where you start. That fundamental knowledge is important, but it is so. I'll say it's partly knowing the best practices and applying them to PBL and understanding the difference between project-based learning and projects. That's a key thing. And if you understand that distinction and follow best practices as best you can, you're going to get very good results with students, both in content, engagement, and performance. So PBL can be extremely effective. I would say also it requires a certain attitude on the part of the instructor. And I've often said that you can determine who's going to be a good PBL teacher by giving them a personality test. And the personality test is one in which you have to be open to your students, open to problem solving, open to divergent solutions, open to just, let's call the joy and play of learning as you try to solve something. And if you come in with that attitude and use good practice, you're going to get good results with PBL.
So with some of these ideas that you talked about, it really doesn't matter what age group are we dealing with. It could be a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old or an 11-year-old, but with some of these key ideas that teachers follow, it will be an effective, learning strategy in the class. Now, our viewers also want to know, Thom, you mentioned design thinking also in your presentation. And they just want to know a few links between design thinking and PBL that will help them in their understanding on the theoretical part, and I'm sure that will lead to the implementation as well.
Yeah, there's two ways to view it, Kanwal. First is design thinking is essentially project-based learning without a driving question. The design thinking is actually centered around solving a problem, but the problem tends to be not as explicit as in PBL in the terms of the driving question. So I see them as very similar processes, really all just two sides of the same process. Now, again, you may be familiar with this yourself. For a long while, there was what they call the messy middle in project-based learning. So you introduce the project, you know what's going to happen at the end, but in between, you're not sure as a teacher. And it gets messy because, well, students are investigating things. And sometimes when they investigate things, they might spend 2 days investigating something that isn't worth investigating. And so it's messy. So I have found that by incorporating design thinking, that sharpens that whole process, because it gives you a way to actually give you a problem-solving method in the heart of a project. So design thinking really lies at the heart of the problem-solving process. That's the way I would see it, which begins, again, empathy, design, draft, refine, share.
Excellent, excellent. And when you talked about messy middle, I think that's where all the learning also happens. The teacher just have to be mindful, so he or she can support that process and facilitate that process. Now, talking about assessments, if you could sort of elaborate a bit more on assessing within a PBL classroom or within a PBL environment. Also, I would like to just remind our viewers that we only have a few minutes left. So we'll just take a couple of more questions before we wrap up. So yes, going back to assessment in a PBL classroom.
Well, assessment, as I said, always includes and starts with and put as the primary assessment a performance rubric that measures performance on the product, because the product that you get cannot be measured by a checklist or a yes or no or a regular mark. It has to be evaluated through performance, means it has different elements or dimensions that you're looking at. So it's always a performance rubric. That also includes a performance rubric for skills. So if you're teaching students to work in a team, you should really work with a collaboration rubric, which shows team members how they're actually functioning with each other. Are they listening? Are they accountable? Are they bringing their work? All the aspects of behavior that make you a good team member. So the second thing, and this is probably most important for listeners, is the question about PBL, does it teach content? You can also teach content and have tests, and you can have quizzes, and you can do traditional teaching within the context of a project. And you can have reports, you can have essays. The goal is just to not make them the only product. So I've seen projects in, for example, humanities or language classes in which reading the book is the project. That's not it. You have to have something beyond that. You have to have products and, well, let's see, I want to say a little more clearly, the content can't just be the only product. If it's just the test, that's not a project. Yeah.
Thank you. I think our viewers will find this response relevant and helpful. Now, thank you so much, Thom. We are at the end of the session. I would now like to formally thank you and all our live audience who have tuned in from all over the world on behalf of Beacon House for participating in the World of Tomorrow 2021 and beyond towards happier futures. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much for your time. And I would like to remind our viewers that there are other exciting events and sessions lined up later tonight and tomorrow, and please watch them, send your comments, and thank you so much, Thom.
Thank you, Kanwal. I really appreciate the invitation. I enjoyed doing the presentation, and good luck to everyone out there doing their projects.
Thank you.